I noticed something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law set the table for Sunday dinner. She arranged the good plates, the white ones with the gold rim that I bought 30 years ago at a little shop in Savannah, in front of everyone except me. My spot got the old ceramic dish I usually used for reheating leftovers, the one with the small chip on the edge that I kept meaning to throw away. I didn't say anything. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and watched my son pour wine for his wife and forgot to offer me any. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years teaching 7th grade English at the same middle school in Columbus, Ohio. I raised my son Marcus alone after his father passed when Marcus was only 11. I worked double shifts in the summers, took on tutoring on weekends, and never once let Marcus go without what he needed. When he graduated college, I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Not from sadness, from relief, from pride, from the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had carried something heavy for a very long time and finally been allowed to set it down. That was 12 years ago. On that Sunday evening, sitting at my own dining room table, in the house I had paid off with money I had earned with my own hands, I watched my daughter-in-law Renee serve herself a second portion of pot roast before asking if anyone else wanted more. She didn't look at me when she asked. She was looking at her phone. My granddaughter Lily was sitting across from me. She was 9 years old and possessed of an honesty that children carry before the world teaches them to be polite instead. She looked at my plate, then at everyone else's, and then she looked up at me with her serious brown eyes and said, very quietly, "Grandma, why do you have the small piece?" I told her I wasn't very hungry. She didn't look convinced. Children rarely are. "I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at this point in my life." That dinner was not the beginning. It was simply the evening I finally let myself admit what had been true for a long time. Marcus and Renee had moved into my house 18 months earlier. It was supposed to be temporary. Renee had lost her job at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 6 years, and Marcus's income as a contractor was inconsistent. They had a lease breaking and nowhere to go, and Lily was only 7, and I had 3 empty bedrooms and a mother's heart, and I said yes before they finished asking. I want you to understand something. I am not a woman who gives reluctantly. When I love someone, I love them completely. I cooked for them every night. I watched Lily after school so they didn't have to pay for a sitter. I covered the electricity bill, the water bill, and the streaming subscriptions without being asked. When Renee's car needed new tires, I gave her my credit card and told her to handle it. When Marcus said the contracting work had dried up for the month, I transferred money into their account without making him ask twice. I did these things because I wanted to. Because Lily needed stability. Because Marcus was my son, and I had never been able to watch him struggle without reaching out my hand. But somewhere in those 18 months, something shifted. I am not entirely sure when it happened, the way seasons change not in a single day, but in a slow accumulation of mornings that are slightly colder than the last. I only know that by the time of that Sunday dinner, I had become a guest in my own home. Renee had rearranged my kitchen. I came downstairs one morning and the coffee mugs were in a different cabinet, and the spice rack had been moved to make room for a knife block she'd ordered online. She hadn't asked. She told me afterward that she'd needed more counter space, and assumed I wouldn't mind. I told her I didn't mind. And I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall for a long time. Marcus had started having his friends over on Friday evenings. Loud evenings, with the television turned up and takeout containers left on the coffee table and beer bottles gathering on my porch railing. I went to bed early on those nights. My bedroom was at the back of the house, and if I put the fan on, I could almost block out the sound. Nobody asked how I was sleeping. Nobody asked much of anything about me, actually, except when something was needed. The month before that Sunday dinner, Renee came to me with a printout from a vacation rental website. She and Marcus wanted to take Lily to Florida for spring break, a week at a house near the beach. She handed me the printout and pointed to the total at the bottom, $1,800, and said that with everything being tight, it would mean a lot if I could help out. She said it the way people say things they have already decided. Not a question, a formality. I wrote the check. I drove them to the airport on a Tuesday morning, came home to a quiet house, and stood in my rearranged kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I had sat in my own living room after 7 in the evening. But I still wasn't ready to see clearly. Not yet. The Sunday dinner was the night that changed that. After Lily asked why I had the small piece, Renee looked up from her phone briefly and said I had told her earlier that I wasn't very hungry. I had said no such thing. I had been in the backyard deadheading the roses when she called everyone to the table. She hadn't come to get me. Marcus had. And only because Lily had asked where Grandma was. I ate what was on my plate. I helped clear the dishes. I washed the pot because the dishwasher was full and I didn't want to leave it soaking overnight. And then Renee came into the kitchen while I was drying my hands and said, in the same light tone she used for everything, that she had found a wonderful spa in the Short North neighborhood. A full-day package massage, facial, the works. She'd already booked it for Saturday and would need to borrow a little money to cover it since Marcus's last payment was delayed. She named the amount. It was $240. I looked at her for a long moment. She was already scrolling on her phone again, showing me the spa's website, narrating the services like a travel agent. I said I would think about it. She looked up then. She wasn't accustomed to that answer. She smiled the way people smile when they are recalibrating, and said, of course, no rush, and went back to the living room. I finished drying my hands. I hung the dish towel on the rack. I turned off the kitchen light, and I walked upstairs to my bedroom, and I sat down in the chair by the window. The chair where I used to grade papers late at night, when Marcus was small and asleep down the hall, and I let myself think clearly for the first time in a long time. I thought about my kitchen cabinets. I thought about the vacation I had funded. I thought about the chip on the ceramic dish. I thought about Lily's face across the table. I thought about the porch railing covered in beer bottles, and the Friday nights I spent with a fan running to drown out the noise in my own house. I thought about 31 years in a classroom and all the mornings I drove to school before sunrise so I could get ahead of the day. I thought about the deed to this house, with my name on it. Only my name. I did not sleep well that night. But by the time the first gray light came through the window, I had made a decision. I was up before 6. I dressed quietly, took my bag, and drove to a diner 2 miles from the house, a place I hadn't been in years, with booths along the window and a waitress named Cheryl who called everyone on and refilled my coffee without being asked. I ordered eggs and wheat toast, and I sat there for an hour with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I wrote down every expense I had covered in the past 18 months. I had kept receipts, not out of suspicion but out of habit. I was an English teacher, and English teachers document things. The total, when I added it carefully, was a number I had not allowed myself to calculate before. It sat there on the legal pad, neat and specific and unavoidable. Then I called my friend Gloria. We had taught at the same school for 19 years, and she was the kind of woman who answered the phone at 6:30 in the morning without complaint and said exactly what she thought without softening it unnecessarily. I told her everything. The whole 18 months. The chip on the dish. The spa. All of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, you know what you need to do." I did know. I had known for a while. I had just needed someone to say it out loud. From the diner, I drove to my bank. My banker was a calm, efficient woman who had helped me refinance my mortgage 8 years earlier. I explained what I needed. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. We updated the accounts. I removed the secondary access that had been added to my checking account 14 months ago. Added, I now recalled, at Renee's suggestion, for convenience, she had said. In case of emergency. Then I called my attorney. I had a will that was 12 years old and needed revisiting regardless, but there were other things to discuss now. He had an opening at 2 that afternoon. By noon I was back home. Marcus and Renee were still asleep. Lily was awake, sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas, eating cereal and watching something on a tablet. When she saw me, she said, "Grandma, you were gone," like it was something remarkable. I kissed her on top of the head and told her I had run some errands. I made myself tea and sat with her at the table, and she showed me what she was watching, a nature documentary about sea otters. We watched it together. She leaned against my arm. That afternoon, I met with my attorney. We talked for an hour and a half. I left his office with clarity I hadn't felt in longer than I could name. On Monday morning, I sat down with Marcus. Renee was out. Lily was at school. Marcus came downstairs in the middle of the morning and found me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. I had made his the way he liked it, since he was 16 years old. 2 sugars, no milk, and the yellow legal pad from the diner. He sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I had thought about this conversation for 36 hours, and I had decided that I would not perform anger, even if I felt it. What I felt, mostly, was sadness. And underneath the sadness, something older and more tired, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has given too much for too long and finally sat down with the arithmetic. I told him I loved him. I meant it completely. Then I turned the legal pad toward him. He looked at the number. He looked at it for a long time. I told him that the arrangement we had was not working. Not because I couldn't afford it, though 18 months had made a substantial mark, but because of what it had become. I told him about the kitchen cabinets. I told him about being called to the table late. I told him about the chip on the dish and what Lily had said, and I watched something move across my son's face that I recognized. He had his father's expressions sometimes, in moments of genuine reckoning, a certain stillness. I told him I needed him and Renee to begin looking for their own place, that I would give them 60 days, and I would help where I reasonably could, but that this house needed to be my home again. Then I told him about the accounts. He was quiet for a long time after that. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, a gesture he'd had since childhood, this way of holding warm things, and he looked out the window at the backyard. He said, "Mom, I didn't realize." I told him I believed him. I also told him that not realizing was its own kind of choice, and that the people who loved you were not required to keep absorbing the cost of it. He nodded slowly. His jaw was tight. There is a difference between a man who is angry at being confronted and a man who is ashamed of what he's being shown. Marcus was the second kind. I had raised him to be the second kind. In that moment, I was grateful for it. He asked me about Lily. He asked it quietly, the way a father asks when he is afraid of the answer. I told him that Lily and I would be fine, that Lily would always be welcome in this house, that being her grandmother was not contingent on any arrangement between him and me, and that would never change. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm the way I had when he was 11 years old. And his father had just died, and I had sat beside him on this same table, different chairs, different house, but the same gesture, and I hadn't known what to say then either, but I had stayed. I stayed now. The conversation with Renee was harder. She came home that evening, and Marcus had already talked to her, and she came into the kitchen where I was starting dinner with a brightness in her eyes that was not quite anger, and not quite tears, and she said, in a voice very carefully controlled, that she thought we had all been getting along well. I told her I thought so too for a while. She said she hadn't realized the financial arrangement was a problem. I told her I hadn't made it clear enough, and that was partly on me. I said it without sarcasm, because I meant it. I had allowed things to become what they became by not saying anything. That was true. She stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed and looked at the counter at the knife block she had put there, and I watched her work through something internally that I couldn't fully see. Then she said, very quietly, that she hadn't meant to make me feel like a guest. I said I knew that. I said I believed she hadn't meant a great many things. And that was also true. We didn't hug. We didn't resolve everything in that kitchen. Real things don't resolve like that, cleanly, in a single evening. But something shifted. The air became something I could breathe more easily. They found an apartment 6 weeks later. A 2-bedroom in Westerville, not far. A reasonable distance for Lily's sake. Moving day was a Saturday in early spring. Cold and bright, with that particular quality of Ohio light in March that is more promise than warmth. I helped them pack. I wrapped Lily's books carefully in newspaper and put them in a box and labeled it in my teacher's handwriting, and Lily watched me do it and said she would miss my cooking. I told her she could come for dinner any Sunday she wanted. She said every Sunday? I said we'd see about that. She grinned. She had her father's grin, which had come from me. After they left, I stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a year and a half. Not empty quiet. There is a difference, though it takes some practice to feel it. I went to the kitchen. I moved the knife block back to the pantry where there was a shelf that fit it perfectly and where it didn't crowd the counter. I put my coffee mugs back in the cabinet on the left, the one with the better morning light. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and looked around at the order of things that I had chosen. Then I made a pot of tea, took it to the back porch, and sat down in the wooden chair that had been there since the year I paid off the house. The yard was starting to come back. The roses along the fence had new growth on them, thin and red and very alive, the way things are in early spring when they are just beginning to remember what they are. I had a book I had been trying to read for 3 months. I opened it to the first page. I read until the tea was gone. I thought about my son, who had called me twice in the past week, just to talk, in the way he used to call me when he first moved into his college dorm and hadn't yet learned to pretend he didn't need to hear my voice. I thought about Lily and the sea otters and the way she had leaned against my arm. I thought about the weight I had been carrying and the long, quiet process of setting it down. I have lived long enough to know that dignity is not something you reclaim in a single dramatic moment. It is not a door you slam, or a check you stop writing, or even a conversation at a kitchen table with a legal pad between you and your son. It is a practice, a daily returning to yourself, a choice, made again and again, to remember what you are worth. I had forgotten for a while. Most of us do, at least once, but I was back now. The yard was quiet. The roses were growing, the tea was gone and the book was good, and the afternoon was entirely mine. I turned the page.